12th of February, 2004, and this is our second meeting. And I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and we're at Dr. Cobb's house in Albuquerque, La Vida Llena. So we had covered my initial list of questions, and Dr. Cobb was going to tell me some of the stuff that he had prepared for the interview last time that we didn't get to.
Okay. You had done the questions you'd asked me, the places I had lived. I don't think we went into that, but I may have told you that we lived in Germany when I was 4 and 5, and France, and then subsequently, of course, lived in many other places, including Philadelphia, Mexico, Syria, North Africa, Italy in the World War II, Boston for medical school, New Haven for pediatric internship, Baltimore for my public health training and teaching, and then off to Pakistan for 4 years, and Algeria on family planning work, and back to Denver in 1965 to 84. I was there as professor and chairman of the Department of Preventive Medicine. During the time I was there on leave, I went to the Philippines for the World Health Organization, and Tunisia, and Togo and Niger, and China in 1985 to 6. That sort of brief summary of the places that I lived. And as far as military service, I think I told you about the American Field Service. I was working as a civilian, volunteer, and the question you connected to an organization, of course, the organization I was connected with was University of Colorado Medical School primarily, and then the American Friends Service Committee and the Rocky Flats Task Force, which was a government-supported. And then let's see what else I thought would be important. Yes, I didn't tell you about the Reagan administration and how it affected our work. When Reagan took office in 1981, and Gorsuch was the head of EPA under Reagan and under James Watt, who was Secretary of Interior, and she then married a man named Buford, so she was known as Ann Buford, and it was her decision to terminate the funding for our study, which was funded by the EPA, and she arranged for that to be stopped. I didn't also mention the recent meeting here in Santa Fe, which was the nuclear policy meeting organized by a group of of people interested in the whole nuclear story, and they had about a 4-hour meeting, I think, and had a lot of very important speakers and all. I have the notes and all on that if you want. Another thing I didn't mention was my work with Ted Radford. He was also, as I was, on the 3 Mile Island Scientific Advisory Committee, and we met about every month for about 3 or 4 years to spend the money which on research, which had been designated in the settlement of the suit against 3 Mile Island. There was $25 million set aside for research, and then whatever else of the money that was spent for compensation of the people that were injured in one way or another by the 3 Mile Island accident. What money was left over from that was also turned to our research. So I worked with that for a good many years, and that was, I think, important, but not directly related to Rocky Flats.
Although it must have been, the work was
Yeah, it was
similar, right?
It was a similar problem. This was a case of an accident that had happened, whereas Rocky Flats, most of it was accidents that might have happened or might someday happen. Then the various people that I worked with in these other studies and all were Howard Home, who was head of the law firm that he was not head of the law firm. He was member of the law firm that was defending or was suing Rocky Flats on behalf of Marcus Church and the landowners. And he was a husband of Barbara Holmes, the state senator. Then there was Judy Danielson, whom I'm sure you know about, and John Goffman, who was one of the first people to be aware of the dangers of radiation. Carl Z. Morgan, who was head of the health and safety at Oak Ridge, and Dan Berger, the lawyer, and John Berger, his brother, who were on this law firm that brought the suit against 3 Mile Island, and Shorky Ibrahim and his group up at Fort Collins, who took the tissues from Los Alamos and I think may have studied them. And then there was this RFP IND-10 paper, which I heard about through a friend, and which related to the spread of plutonium from Rocky Flats. And that was a study done privately for the Dow Chemical Company and was classified by the Dow Chemical Company. It was not a government document, but they withheld it from us until this friend of mine told me about it, and we got it. Then there was all the relationship with Dr. Mancuso, who was the man that was hired by the government to study the he was professor of epidemiology at Pittsburgh, and he was doing a study for the government on the incidence of cancer at the nuclear facilities around the country. And his relationship with Alice Stewart in England, who was the epidemiologist who got his data and analyzed it and found out there was a lot of cancer in the various facilities working on nuclear power and nuclear bombs. Then I wanted to tell you about the spiderwort studies that we were doing with Dr. Shintaro Hida. He found out about this little plant which is very sensitive to radiation. It's called the spiderwort. And he came to Denver and gave me some of those, and we grew them and put them around Rocky Flats and out in various other places in Colorado to monitor the amount of radiation that was being dispersed. And then the business of monitoring badges I think we did talk about that in the interviews already. And Bruce DeBoskey's cases of people who had died of cancer, that he was the lawyer who sued Rocky Flats for these, on behalf of the widows of these men, and won some of those cases. And I worked very closely with him. And then I guess I told you about Eileen Wilson, her studies of the people who'd been injected with plutonium early on, and she published that book, and I helped her with the early part of that study. Well, those are the things that I thought of that we might want to talk about. And I don't think there's anything else very special here that we didn't talk about. And then as I looked over the tapes of the first two sessions, I remembered that Art Solomon was the name of the head of the Department of Biophysics at Harvard, with whom I worked when I was a medical student doing research on autoradiography. And I don't know if I mentioned the work I did in Mexico with the American Friends Service Committee in 1941, earthquake relief and malaria control. And then I did mention Monty Greinitz, who concluded from her studies of my report that Rocky Flats had had a criticality event which dispersed isotopes that would not be found unless there had been a criticality. And these were found in the control samples of people whom we studied for plutonium. And I think we should mention also Wes Eford, who was one of the authors of our study, and he was a mass spectrographer first at the Air Force Base in California, where they were studying the samples of air gathered from airplanes flying around the world to find out what the Chinese were doing about atomic bomb, whether or not they were making one. And then he was the one that was doing the mass spectrography for our specimens that we collected at Rocky Flats. Then he went to work with the EPA for a short time, and then he went to the lab at Los Alamos, which is where I think he now is. I think those are the main things that I thought of that we hadn't covered.
Okay. Do you want to go into detail on specifics of those, or?
Well, whichever ones you want. I don't know what.
What are there ones that let's look at your list that you sort of ran through them pretty quickly, so if there's certain ones that you want to I'm going to have a list of questions here too, but it sounds like you probably have more to say on all those ones.
Well, I think that the work I did with Tom Cochran and Ted Radford on getting the facts out about the dangers of radiation, and in particular in relation to 3 Mile Island and in relation to the plan to make a reprocessing plant in this country to reprocess the waste from nuclear power plants and to extract the plutonium from that and use it for other purposes like making it a fuel for power plants or material for bombs. And that was stopped by the suit brought largely by Tom Cochran and the I can't remember the name of the organization that he worked for at that time, but it was, I think, quite successful and did stop the progress on, it stopped in its tracks, the plan to make a reprocessing plant in this country. So I think that was important.
And how did he brought a suit against DOE?
I think it was probably against the government. I'm not sure, but I think it was against the government in general, DOE, I guess, in particular. And I testified on the basis of the report that I had made on Rocky Flats and the findings we had there and the dangers that I perceived. And I think it was significant that this whole report was made part of the proceedings of that lawsuit. So therefore it was a public document, and therefore the government couldn't sequester it completely and had to release it through the NTIS. So that was an important...
This is the EPA study that you did.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually had a question about that study. How did you get your samples?
Well, we first of all went to the various hospitals that were near Rocky Flats and also down in Puebla, Colorado, and explained to them what we were doing and asked them to let us know when they had an autopsy from somebody who lived in that area around Rocky Flats or in the area which was our control area outside of the Rocky Flats area but still within Colorado. And they did, and then we would go and get the tissues. We always had to get permission from the next of kin to do that, and then we got the organs and made the studies on them. We also interviewed the next of kin, and we also got data from whatever was available from the hospital where they died.
And you had said that you were able to do some analysis, but you had not been able to do the analysis on the gonads that you had hoped to do before the funding was cut.
That's right.
What was the analysis you were able to do was on lungs and other organs?
And livers, lungs and livers. The other organs, the bones, the adrenals, and the gonads were not done while I was still in charge, but when the funding was stopped, we sent the remaining frozen tissues down to Los Alamos where they remained, and I think Los Alamos did some studies of the bones for the, I think it was for Rockwell, but I'm not sure. And I guess they found what they expected to find. I don't think it's very exciting. But the gonads were never studied.
And was Shaki Ibrahim planning to study, was he planning to pick up where you left off?
Well, he got the tissues and was planning to do a study which would have been supported by the government, and how much he was influenced by the government's desire not to have the real truth come out, I don't know, but he was designing a study which would have negated the purpose for which I had been gathering the gonads, and that was to find out how much was in the gonads in individual cases and where they came from, so that you'd be able to make a map and find out, you know, whether the ones living near to Rocky Flats had more and the ones living far away had less.
And instead, how did he want to study the gonads? He had a different methodology?
He was going to take all the gonads and put them into one big pot and analyze the whole thing, and then get a figure from that of how much was in each gonad on the average. but not getting individual measurements of each one.
So you would have done the larger, the Rocky Flats group versus the control group in terms of what was in the gonads, but not where each specific
Yeah,
gonad came from?
I think that was his plan, yeah.
And did he do that?
I don't know, because I opted out of it. He wanted my blessing, and I didn't give it to him. So he may not have ever done the study. I don't know. He never told me.
And what would be the benefit of this sort of individualized research versus the aggregate research?
Well, the aggregate would have had some advantage that it would have given you a larger amount of plutonium to work with, and you might have gotten a more accurate measurement of the total amount of plutonium in all of those gonads. However, Wes Eford and his mass spectrography method of measuring it thought that he could get meaningful measurements on each gonad. And it seemed to me it was desirable to do it that way and get the more detailed information rather than just one figure for the whole bunch.
Couldn't you have done both? Or couldn't Dr.
No, you couldn't do both, because if you did the individual ones, you wouldn't be able to pool it. Or if you did the pooling, you wouldn't be able to get the individual data.
Why couldn't you pool it if you did the individual ones? Couldn't you take
Well, you have to take one gonad and dissolve it and so forth, and take all the plutonium that you get in it and put it on a little tiny thing that you put into the mass spectrograph, and then measure the amount of it. You have to use all of it. And it's all gone. You haven't anything you can pool then anymore.
Oh, I see. So, but couldn't you have taken the results from the individual stuff and said, well, there's this much in this gonad, and this much in that gonad?
Or you could have added it all up.
Together?
Yeah, you could have, yeah. But the accuracy probably would have been less because the amount was so small. See, if you can measure it, say, within 1,000th of 1% on a large sample, you might be able to measure within 1% on the individual samples.
So the pool, they would have put all the gonads, dissolved them all together and see
Yeah.
how much. Oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. What do they dissolve them?
I think sulfuric acid, maybe sulfuric and nitric, I guess.
And when you say gonads, you mean testicles and
Ovaries, yeah.
So you put them all in together in a vat of acid? And
Yeah.
Wow. Leroy Moore had mentioned to me on Tuesday when I saw him that there was some other study, on a tissue study, following up on yours that was recently released, and he wanted me to ask you about that. He said that they had found that plutonium concentrations increased the closer you got to Rocky Flats, but then they concluded that that meant it was just background radiation.
Who is this?
Leroy Moore, the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. He's
Yeah.
on our committee and is very involved in.
Yeah. I don't remember any such study. When was it done?
I think it's quite recent. Just came out. I'll do a little more research. I can send you. He actually is. I gave him your phone number, so he
Good.
may call you and talk to you about it. But
Yeah.
He told me that I should ask you about it if you knew anything.
No. I when I left Denver, I cut off most of those channels, so I didn't hear about that. I'd be interested.
Well, I can give you his information too. I do think he's planning to contact you.
Good.
Okay, why don't you had mentioned Ann Gorsuch cutting off your funding. Did you get a sense of her motivation? Did she mention?
I think she was told to by James Watt, who was told to by Ronald Reagan, the White House. That's a guess. I mean, I don't know why else they would have done it.
And again, they didn't want that information to be what they didn't want to hear because they weren't prepared to change anything at Rocky Flats. Is that your sense?
I don't know about that, but I think they were afraid of what it would show that Rocky Flats had made such a terrible mess and scattered plutonium all around. And it got into people. I mean, that is serious.
you tell me again, I know it's in the last tape, but the results of your tissue study that you were able to get before your funding was cut off, what did you find?
Well, it's in the report. If you want me, I could read it. My memory is not totally clear on it, but especially in the livers, we found that the Rocky Flats plutonium, which had the, you might call it the fingerprint of weapons-grade plutonium. You could distinguish weapons-grade plutonium from fallout plutonium by the isotope ratios. And we found that there was significant amount of weapons-grade plutonium in the livers of the people who lived near Rocky Flats. It was a very small amount. Question of whether it was enough to cause any cancers or genetic defects or whatever, we never settled. Nobody knows, because nobody knows how much you need to have in a gonad in order to cause defects in the offspring and cancers and malformations and so forth. That's been done with animals, but has not been done with humans.
To this day?
To this day, as far as I know. I haven't been following the literature lately, but...
I guess it sounds, from reading the papers that you gave me, it sounds to me like that's the $1 million question, right? How do you determine what's an acceptable risk and probabilities, and did you maintain it from your perspective that you should minimize, since we don't know the risk, it should be minimized? And did you feel that the powers that be felt the opposite, since we don't know the risk, there's more leeway?
Well, yes. Then there's all this business about the question of whether low-level radiation is more harmful per unit of radiation than high-level radiation. And the question of whether it's a straight line relationship or whether it's a curve like this or a curve like that. And this is still being debated. It seems to me fairly evident that there is no safe minimum dose. And therefore, you have to be concerned about a cumulative dose. And it does not go away. If it's in your gonads, it stays there and keeps on radiating the sperm or the eggs before they're made into humans. And that could be, in the long run, a very serious thing.
The low versus high level radiation theory is that with high levels of radiation, it may actually kill off the cells, but low levels may just sit there and radiate them and mutate them. Is that the...
That's it, yeah. In other words, this was Dr. Oh dear. He worked at the NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research. Martel, yeah. He was the one that came up with the hypothesis that a hot particle embedded in the lung would kill all the cells within a certain radius, and so it would not cause a cancer. But a warm particle, or a very low dose, would radiate cells in its neighborhood but not kill them, and those ones that had been damaged but not killed would then reproduce and become cancer cells. And that was his theory, and I think probably he was right.
And the science currently, it's still up for debate, this issue?
I think so. I haven't seen anything that settled that argument, and I still see articles on both sides.
Are you 20 years later, 30 years later, more comfortable with I mean, with the state of uncertainty in the science, do you still think it's as alarmingly uncertain as it was when you were in the thick of it?
Well, I've been out of it now for more than 20 years, and I'm not following the literature, so I can't say. But I certainly haven't changed my mind that we have to consider the worst case in making decisions about public health. You take the plausible worst case and take your preventive measures on the basis of that. And that's what Dr. Carl Johnson was doing when he said it's not a good idea to have housing that near the Rocky Flats. Mm-hmm. And I think he was right. He was being cautious. And I think that's what we should do in public health, and not wait until people start dying of cancer and when you can prove that it was caused by.
Is that the general public health philosophy, or is there a debate within the public health?
No, I mean, it's same thing when you've got people trying to poison or infect people with germs in Washington. You know, they send letters with various kinds of germs in them, or ricin or whatever, and nobody has actually been infected or killed by any of those attempts. But I'll tell you, they're being very damn cautious that none of this mail gets to the senators and government officials and so forth. Mm-hmm. And they're radiating all the mail. Now I think they're actually taking the mail and copying it by photographic process and then sending it to the senators and so forth. I mean, that's a very expensive thing, and they're doing that without any evidence that anybody was ever hurt by this.
But in the case of radiation issues and the nuclear weapons complex, did you feel that those precautions were being overlooked because of?
Well, they wanted to have a nuclear bomb, and they wanted to use it, and that was not conducive to that sort of action.
So that sort of overturned traditional
Yeah.
public health approach.
Well, you've got to remember that all this atomic science was developed during the war for the purpose of making a bomb.
Right.
And that was all top secret, and everybody wanted to keep it secret so that it wouldn't get out that this might be dangerous. And they didn't know how dangerous it might be, and that was why they were injecting these people that were pretty near dead with plutonium to find out what it did to them. Some of them lived 20 more years and surprised the people that had done the injections, and caused the furor that was raised when Eileen Welsom discovered who they were and followed up on it.
So how do you determine an acceptable risk in public health? How do people reach that number?
Well, it's done by probabilities, and something like 1 chance in 1,000 or 1 chance in 1,000,000, whatever is considered satisfactory. You take that number, that fraction of people exposed that would get cancer, and say what is acceptable to the public, and then you do the arithmetic and find out what the level of exposure could be safely.
So then the argument is over what is acceptable to the public.
Yeah.
And there's no standard 1 in 1,000,000 or 1 in 250,000 or whatever it is.
Well, they've used different figures. Different people use different figures depending on what they want to prove. And, they talk about the chance of being hit by a meteorite. is that acceptable? Apparently it is to most people. They don't go around with a shield that would keep meteorites off. And so then you start from there and you try to figure out what would be acceptable in terms of radiation.
And did you get the sense that that people did not want that research to be done with the radiation because they just didn't, were they afraid of what you were going to find out, or?
Well, the Rocky Flats management, that is Rockwell International or Dow Chemical, were very much afraid that they would be exposed as having been careless and having spread plutonium around and exposed workers and all, and that would have been a bit black mark on their scutcheon. So they didn't want that. And also the government was concerned because the government was very much into producing atomic bombs and nuclear power and all that, and they didn't want that to be undermined. So both were in this together.
Do you think the government had made a calculation that better to lose a few lives to cancer than slow down the arms race? Well,
they couldn't have because they didn't know the facts at that time. You see, it was John Goffman and Tom Cochrane and Templin that were the first ones to make some calculations to find out what the risk actually was. And then when that came out, it was when the government asked Mancuso to do a study of the cases of cancer in the nuclear industry, and they assumed that he would find there was nothing. But when this man up in Washington, a public health man, found there were more cases of cancer than there should have been in the neighborhood of, was it Hanford or some up there anyway, that hit the fan, and the government asked Mancuso to look at his data and show that this man up in Washington couldn't have been right. And he looked at the data from Washington and said he could be right, and he looked at his data and he said, I can't deny that it was right. And so then they fired him. But fortunately, he had already sent his data to Alice Stewart in England, where U.S. government couldn't get at it. And she went ahead and did the studies that showed that the exposure of the workers in the nuclear weapons industry were much more likely to have cancer than others. So.
And did that change in the way the government approached?
I'm sure it did, yeah. The standards have gone more strict steadily over the years, ever since then. They've made lower and lower thresholds permissible.
One of the things I was wondering was how you became convinced or how you decided to focus on gonads and became convinced that that was perhaps the biggest risk involved.
It was from the reading I did. There was an article published by one of the government labs. I can't remember the name of the man or the name of the article or anything, but I have it all somewhere. It would be in my papers in the archives at the University of Colorado. But he found in studying rats that injecting them with plutonium in certain small amounts, that a very large percent of it was deposited in the liver and the lungs and the gonads, and the concentration in the gonads of these rats was higher than the concentration in the lungs or the liver when they were maybe 3 years old. And it took that long to get, through the whole system. And he did radio autographs of the gonads and found that it was deposited in the basement membrane right near where the sperm were being generated. And that, of course, within range of an alpha ray, which is not a very, it may be only 4 or 5 cells. So it was my concern that this would be the worst place to have plutonium in your body. And if it was there in significant amounts, that would be, not only endangering the present, but all future generations, because it would be damaging the genes. So I really thought that was the crux of it all. And on that basis, I asked the EPA to include the gonads in this study, and they agreed.
Why did you end up doing the gonads last, or not getting to them?
Because the technology wasn't there yet to measure them individually. See, they didn't have a good enough method to measure the amount of plutonium in a very small gonad, weighing only 5 or 6 grams. There'd be very little plutonium, maybe 1 or 2 picocuries. And that is not enough for the measurements that they were doing at that time at the Air Force Base lab. But Wes Eford, after he came to Los Alamos, developed better methods. And he found that, and he was working on it then, but he hadn't developed it yet. So we were sort of waiting until he got the method good, and good enough to make it worth doing. And he told me that he did have it, I guess maybe 15 years ago. And by that time it was too late, there wasn't any money. So
lungs and liver were big enough that you were able to measure them individually, or did you?
Yes, yeah, we have, have a liver of maybe 2,000 grams, and you could even take it, cut it in half, and use one as a control and the other in the study and so forth, so that you could find plenty of plutonium in the livers. And in the lungs it was less because they weigh less, and the plutonium is taken out of the lung by the lymph nodes, and so if you don't study the lymph nodes, you don't get the whole story. But in the liver, it's actually deposited right in the liver. So we got very good measurements from the liver.
And you found that it was more concentrated in certain areas?
Of the liver, or I mean,
of
the geographic areas, yeah. Well, these data were, you might say, disputable. I think the most important fact was that we found weapons-grade plutonium in the livers and the lungs, and that it was in the people that lived near Rocky Flats. But because we stopped the study before we did all of those, we didn't have enough to prove without a doubt that it was more in the ones near than it was in the ones far. But the fact was it was there, and it couldn't have come from any place but Rocky Flats, because no other place in Colorado was using weapons-grade plutonium.
And the fallout wasn't weapon?
No, the fallout after the bomb is blown off, you have a whole different set of isotopes.
Oh, okay.
You see, you have a criticality. This produces other isotopes, and then when you study these particles of plutonium coming from a bomb, it has a different fingerprint. You can recognize that easily.
So before it's exploded versus after?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay. I noticed in your papers that there was a discussion in the 70s of converting Rocky Flats to civilian uses, or to become a nuclear, a solar energy institute or something like that. At what point and you may have been gone when this happened, but at some point that wasn't discussed anymore, and now it's going to be a refuge, a wildlife refuge. Do you know how that happened?
I don't know, but I guess that they found that there was too much plutonium scattered in the soil there, and other things, especially the heavy metals that they used in the bomb. Can't remember. But they found that the soil there was sufficiently contaminated that it wouldn't be a good place to have people working and living. And even the wildlife refuge had some questions because they had some evaporation ponds there where they put their waste liquids to evaporate so they could then concentrate it and bury it or get rid of it some other way. But the trouble was that they had ducks and geese and things flying in and getting contaminated in this contaminated water and then flying off to other places, and that was a worry. So the idea of being a wildlife refuge, if it involved flying birds, was not very good. And also wild animals can move around, and unless you fence it.
Yeah. Do you think that the decision to close Rocky Flats, do you think the protests had an impact on that, or do you think it was just the geopolitical situation?
I think it had enormous impact. Yeah. I'm sure it did. It was in the press. It was, in the paper every 2 or 3 days. There'd be more about it, and yeah, there was a lot of concern, and the Physicians for Social Responsibility took it up. Helen Caldecott came out and gave talks, and Alice Stewart came to Denver and gave talks, and she of course also testified in the suits against Rocky Flats, and they won several suits, and this was unheard of, that the government, with all its lawyers and all its millions of dollars to spend on defending itself, actually had to pay up for these guys who'd gotten cancer. So it was a big thing.
I interviewed Maury Wolfson.
Maury Wolfson, yeah.
He thinks that he's maintained that none of it, that if it hadn't been for the end of the Cold War, none of this would have mattered. They still would have kept producing the bombs. But that
well, and George Bush wants to produce some more now.
Yeah. But not at Rocky Flats.
Not at Rocky Flats, no, but they'll do them probably in New Mexico.
So do you think if it had the Cold War continued, or had there been a terrorist attack the day the Cold War ended and it was clear that there was this other threat we hadn't thought about, do you think that Rocky Flats would have closed if that situation hadn't changed?
That'd be a speculation. I don't know. I think Rocky Flats was bad enough that they would have had to stop it and start somewhere else. I mean, it was really bad.
In bad shape.
Yeah, I mean, it was really bad. They were having people dying of cancer because of their exposures. And that gets out, and, not many people are going to want to work there.
Yeah. I was wondering how if you felt there was a relationship between your interest in international development and family planning and the Rocky Flats issue.
Well, the relationship with family planning is perhaps a rather remote one, but the fact is that the trouble in the world is in general a result of increasing population and using up the resources, and so people fighting over it. And if you're fighting to protect your resources, then you go to war and you use whatever you've got, and you probably will use nuclear weapons if you have them. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of a remote connection, and a lot of people don't think about it in that way.
Did your interest in disarmament evolve from your family planning background, or did they just both sort of happen to you?
Well, I think my interest in disarmament was first, even before nuclear weapons. But they sort of developed together, I guess, the concern about disarmament. I mean, there was a lot of talk right after World War II, even after World War I, of disarmament. And that was the origin of the League of Nations and the United Nations. The whole idea was to control these things. But the question of nuclear power and dangers was not until after World War II. And it didn't really come to a very large concern. For example, with the Physicians for Social Responsibility, that was back in the late 70s, I think, that they became concerned. And so that's, you know, at least 30 years after the war. I think gradually people are realizing the dangers and the problems. And I think that maybe there'll be enough wisdom in the world to stop George Bush from making any more nuclear weapons. But that might not happen. I don't know.
We'll see about that, huh?
Yeah.
Another interesting thing, sort of back to the previous question I'd asked about the closure, and you're saying nobody would want to work there. You had written an article or an opinion piece about comparing nuclear workers to untouchables.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah. This came to me when I saw a movie about the untouchables made by an Indian producer, director, and it was shown in Denver in the annual, you know, movie fest that they have there. And this was a movie about the untouchables of India. And the story was an untouchable family, one of the lowest caste, had too many babies, and they put their baby in a basket and let it float down the river, and some woman of a high caste who was not having any luck getting pregnant found the baby and brought it to her husband as hers, and they grew up as a Raja and all this. And the story was that finally this man found out his origins, and so this was the dissolving of the caste system in India, which hasn't really dissolved yet, but that was the pitch, and the idea was that India is now a modern state, and here were these nuclear power plants, and that was the final scene, was nuclear power plants that were rising up on the horizon, and India was modern and wasn't bothered with the caste system anymore. And so I went up to the guy, the producer, who was there in Denver with his movie. It was a prize-winning movie. And I asked him if it was in his mind that the people that work in those nuclear power plants were being exposed to radiation and therefore were being poor risks for a husband. You wouldn't want your daughter to marry a person that worked in a nuclear power plant because, you know, offspring might be deformed or have cancers and so forth. And he said no, he'd never thought of that. But to me it was so it struck me right away when I saw that picture. Here is the new caste. And in Japan, the hibakusha, they were the people that had been exposed to the bomb in Hiroshima. And they were not good marriage partners. They were outcast in a sense because they'd been exposed. So that was a fact in Japan, and I don't believe he knew that and didn't think about this when he put this symbol of modernism up as the final coup de grace of the caste system.
This is a fiction film, right?
Yes, oh yes.
So I don't get the sense that the people who worked at Rocky Flats had problems getting married, although many of them marry each other. But,
I don't think so. But if that thing progressed and we had some explosions of nuclear weapons, be a different story.
yeah. I guess right now they probably are actually better marriage prospects because they're paid well.
Yeah.
Right?
But you might want to look into the people that were exposed, the downwinders, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That Udall took up their cause, and they had quite a series of suits and all that. But I think that in that area of Montana and Utah, the people who had been exposed to radiation probably weren't going to tell their prospective spouse about it because they would know that they might have been damaged. Their genes might have been damaged.
Interesting. Well, we're almost an hour, so maybe I'll stop this and we can take a break and
Okay.
watch tapes. Of February 2004, I'm with Dr. Jock Cobb, and I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and this is our second meeting, and we're just going to run over a few last things and then call it a day. So you were going to talk about the spiderwort guy.
Yeah. He was working in Japan. I gave you his name, but I don't have it right here.
We'll have it on there too. So.
Okay. And he had done some research using the spiderwort, planting them around the various nuclear plants, power plants, in Japan. And he was able to show that the spiderworts that were downwind from the power plant had a much higher level of mutations than the ones upwind. And also he could relate it to when the power plant was functioning or when it was for some reason shut down. And he could show a very distinct relationship in the mutations in the spiderwort plant, which he measured with looking in a microscope. I don't know if you know, but the stamen of the spiderwort is a chain of single cells that look blue in a well, you have a hybrid blue-pink plant, and the blue is dominant. And if you have a mutation in the blue gene, then the pink shows through. So what you do is look through the microscope and count the number of pink cells that you see, and that is related to the amount of radiation that that particular plant received in the last few days. So it's very sensitive, much more sensitive than any other known method of measuring radiation. So he came and stayed with us in Denver, gave me some of these plants, which he brought in his baggage, and we grew them. And there was a man at National Jewish Hospital who was doing research in lungs and things, but he was interested in it, and he and I began measuring these plants and found we could do pretty well, consistently and all. And then we began putting them around rocky flats to see how much radiation we were getting, and it became very time-consuming. You know, it takes hours and hours to look through the microscope and count all these things, and I couldn't do that. I was, you know, teaching classes and everything. So I hoped he would, and he was trying to find a way of getting volunteers to help us and all. But about that time, we just decided that we couldn't do it ourselves and had to stop. But it was it was enough to scare the folks at Rocky Flats quite a bit, because they knew how sensitive this thing was, and they were afraid that it would show up a ongoing radiation exposure from Rocky Flats. So that was kind of fun.
You know, I actually had a note to myself that to ask you about, you mentioned in your papers Dr. Yoder.
Yes.
Tell me about him.
Lou Yoder. He was supposedly the safety engineer, or the safety responsible for safety at Rocky Flats. And so I disagreed with him about a good many things, and his job, of course, was to keep anything from getting into the press that was harmful to Rocky Flats. But I didn't have too much to do with him.
I saw there was a sort of couple of exchanges and letters to the editor or something like that, where he said one thing and you said the other thing. And
Yeah.
I didn't know if he was sort of your nemesis, or your public health nemesis in some way. Or
Well, they were really upset about things I was doing. They were really trying to get rid of me. I don't know. He was doing his job, and I was doing what I thought was my job, and they were conflicted, that was all.
how were they trying to get rid of you?
Well, I think I told you that they tried to get me fired from the university, and that didn't work because they found I had tenure, which I was damn glad I had.
How did they try to get you fired? What did they?
Well, with I don't know exactly, but I think they were working through the dean, trying to get me, you know, discredit me and so forth. But since I had tenure, they gave that up, and then they tried to discredit me as being a conscientious objector during the war, you know, the way they tried to do with some of the candidates for president. And they found that I'd been decorated as an ambulance driver, and so they decided that wouldn't work. So they couldn't get rid of me until I retired. I guess they were glad to see me go.
Yeah. And then you never heard from them again, I assume.
No, I have. You know, they've Bruce DeBoskey, the lawyer who was bringing these cases against Rocky Flats, was continuing to pursue these cases, and every now and then he would ask me to come up and testify, which I did. And these people would be all there. I'd be testifying what we found, and, you know. And as I say, they won several of these cases, which is surprising because, oh, those lawyers, there'd be 6 or so of the lawyers, you know, paid millions of dollars to defend Rocky Flats against these upstarts.
How did you and Bruce DeBoskey connect?
That was interesting. I had a lawyer when I was on the Rocky Flats Task Force, I think it was. A lawyer in town in Denver came to me and he had a client whose it was the wife of a man who had died of cancer after working at Rocky Flats. And he had gotten the records for this man, his exposure records to plutonium and so forth, and he showed them to me and wanted to know if I thought there was a case there that could be pursued. Well, I didn't know too much about it. I looked at it, and it didn't seem to me it was worthy of a lawsuit, but I wasn't sure. But a year or two later, Alice Stewart was in town. I had invited her to give a lecture, and I showed her this bunch of stuff that this lawyer had given me and asked her to look at it and see if she thought there was a case there. And she said, well, she'd take it home and study it, and then she wrote me a letter saying, yes, it's a very good case, and you should pursue it. Well, I tried to get hold of that lawyer, and he had retired. And I tried to find somebody that would have had his cases and all that, but couldn't do that. I didn't know how. And Bruce DeBoskey had about that time arrived in Denver. And he called me up. I've forgotten why, but he wanted to find out about Rocky Flats, I guess. And he was interested in the question of pursuing cases at Rocky Flats. He was a very environmentally concerned lawyer. And so I told him about this guy, this case, and he said, well, that's interesting. It was already now about, I think, more than 12 years since the original case had been raised. And he said, well, I'll look into it, and he did. And he found the lawyer, and he had retired, and he got permission from that lawyer to pick up this case, and he found out that it had not been dismissed, and even though it was something like 12 years, I think, since the original case had been filed, the judge had not dismissed it, even though both the lawyer for the prosecution and the lawyer for the defense at Rocky Flats had requested that it be dismissed. The judge was smart enough to realize that this might be really something worth keeping on the books. So he did not dismiss it, and it was therefore still on the books and still operable, because even though it had passed the whatever number of years it is that a case dies, it hadn't, because he hadn't dismissed it. And so Bruce DeBoskey took that case and won it. That was the first case that was won against Rocky Flats.
Was this the brain? Was it that case?
No, that was another case. This was a guy who died of lung cancer, I think. The brain was another case. That was, can't remember his name, but he knew he was dying of cancer of the brain. And he wanted to be sure that his brain would be studied by somebody that was not involved with Rocky Flats. So he told me that he wanted his brain to go into our study, and we would then send it to the lab in California and all that. Well, when he died, Rocky Flats was also very eager to get his brain. And they went to his widow before we had a chance to meet her, and said that they had the right to that brain. And she assumed that they were representing me, and signed her permission for them to get the tissue, which then they went to the hospital and got it. And when the lawyer found out about that was Bruce DeBoskey. When he found out what had happened, he was just very upset. And he went to Rocky Flats and tried to get it back. And they said, well, it's already gone down to Los Alamos. And then he tried to get it back from Los Alamos, because he had the papers, you see, from him and his wife saying he wanted it. Los Alamos had lost it, they said. And so he raised hell about that, but then he went back to Rocky Flats and he said, I want to get measurements of the radiation level at the place that man was sitting, because he talked about a pipe which was going right past his head, which contained plutonium from time to time. It was a ventilation pipe, I think. And they wanted to get a measurement of the amount of plutonium there and the radiation from that pipe. And they said, oh, sorry, that's all been destroyed. And we took it down. And they said, well, what about the measurements in that room? Because they made measurements in every room of the radiation level. Oh, no, those have been all shredded. So he thought, that's very sad. And finally down at Los Alamos, they found the brains. And they said, you can have them now, but unfortunately we've spiked them in such a way that you can't use them for measurements that you want to make.
How did they spike them?
They added plutonium or something like that, some isotopes.
Were they studying it, or they just...
I don't know. I don't know whether they spiked it or whether they just told us they did or whatever. But anyway, with that, of course, Bruce went to the jury and told them the story, and it was an easy case to win. The jury just didn't buy that.
That's eerie, huh?
Yeah.
The other thing you had mentioned that I don't think you got into was radiation badges, the monitoring badges.
Yeah.
Tell me what you were going to say about what you wanted to say about that.
I thought maybe I had. I went to the manager for Rockwell and asked him about the method of measurement of the badges. And he took me down to see the guy who was doing it. And I watched him doing it, and then I asked about the standard. You know, when you're making measurements of that sort, you have a standard, and you measure that, and then you measure the ones that you're interested in, and every now and then you measure the standard in a regular way. Well, the standard looked very different from the badges themselves. So the man that was doing it always knew when he had the standard, and he'd be very careful. When he was doing the badges, he did them as fast as he could. And they had a rule that if it was above a certain density, they throw them out, because that was assumed to be because a worker had exposed his badge purposely to some radiation source. And workers were doing that to see if the radiation badges were any good. And they would put it near a source and then hand it in at the end of the period. And if it came back with a high dose, they'd know that something was actually being measured. But they never came back positive, so they knew that they were for nuts. And so I knew that and talked to the man about that. And he said, yeah, we have a standard above which we always throw them out. So you don't get the high dose ones, and you don't get a good accurate measurement of the low dose ones. And so those badges were essentially worthless. And I imagine that was standard operating procedure in most of the nuclear plant procedures. I don't know.
Do you remember in our previous interview, did you talk about Alice Stewart? I know we talked about her, but I think it might have been while we were taking a break. But you reviewed it more recently then.
Okay, well, Alice Stewart was called in by Dr. Mancuso at Pittsburgh. He had the study that he was doing, all the data, on the workers in the various nuclear plants like Oak Ridge and Rocky Flats and so forth. And he was in the process of analyzing it when this man in Washington State did the study that showed there was an effect on cancer from the nuclear exposure. And therefore, the government asked Mancuso to look into it and see if, in his data, there was any evidence of such an effect. Well, he thought that Alice Stewart would be a good person to help him with that analysis, and so he gave the data to her, which was lucky because since she lived in England, when the government wanted to stop that, they couldn't get it back from her, and she went ahead and finished the study with money that we gave her from the 3 Mile Island Fund. That was how that got into that. So, Mancuso was always very sad that he couldn't finish the study himself, because his funds were cut off when he refused to say that the Washington State study was not kosher.
Is he still alive?
Mancuso? I don't know. I guess not, but I don't know.
He was older than.
He was older than I am.
Well, anything else? Looks like you guys probably need to be going, right?
Yeah, I think we better be going.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And for
Yeah.
sharing all your memories.